When I was in my 20s, I worked as a stockbroker. Very successful at it, I was too. The problem was, it was never really me. I'm not a corporate guy, or really a city guy either. By the time I was in my early 30s, I'd made my number, so I quit. People thought I was nuts, but I knew exactly what I was going to do. I bought a cabin in the Rockies. It wasn't like I was Grizzly Adams or anything, though I knew enough about the outdoors to make a go of it. Hunting, surviving if I got into trouble, all that sort of stuff. It was really more about finding solitude and getting away from my former life. I would go up there when the spring thaw started and come back to the city once winter set in. The cabin was fairly isolated. There were some people living within a few miles and some dirt tracks that you could get vehicles around when it wasn't winter. So I brought a truck with plenty of supplies at the start of the season. The cabin had creature comforts. Like I said, being a wilderness man wasn't the object of the exercise, so it was very cozy. By late May, I'd had a very enjoyable and very peaceful number of weeks there. I spent my time hiking around the area and maintaining the cabin lot during the day. At night I would read a book or see what was going on in the outside world via the satellite internet setup I had there. Not that often though. I would go for days in complete isolation, the occasional deer or fox being the only other living thing I would see. One quiet night about 11 p.m, I was reading and relaxing in a chair in front of the fireplace. I heard a bit of scuffling from outside near where my truck was parked, which I assumed to be an animal, maybe even a bear, although in all the time I'd been up here, I'd only seen them out in the trail. When I looked out of the window, it was very dark, of course. I was able to make out the shape of my truck, and while it might have been my imagination, thought I saw some sort of figure moving away from it. I shrugged it off and went to sit down again. Then there was a knock at the door. A knock? Who the hell could that be out here? It wasn't as if someone could just walk up to the place. I moved cautiously to the door, which was solid, but had a peephole drilled. Outside was the gloomy vision of a scruffy man, looking every inch the outdoorsman. Full beard, check shirt, weather-beaten. There wasn't really enough light to tell from his face whether he had bad intentions. "What do you want?" I said suspiciously. "Hey there," came back the gravelly voice with as much friendliness as he could muster. "I need some help." "With what?" "I'm a hungry prospector. Some wolves chased me out of my camp and took everything," he replied. I thought for a second. There were some gold seams in the area, so the story was plausible, but I wasn't letting anybody in late at night. "You can sleep in the flatbed of my truck till morning," I offered. "Then I'll see what I can do for you." The visitor paused and turned his head, almost as if someone else was there with him. After a moment he said, "Oh, come on, man. Let me in, I'm in bad shape here." "No," I insisted. "Take it or leave it." Behind me down the hallway and through the back kitchen, there was a sudden crash. It was an old trick. Distract me at the front door, and someone else smash in the back. "Yeah, Billy Ray," the front door voice shouted. "We're coming in, asshole." My weapon was upstairs, kept beside my bed. I didn't have time to get up there and back. Thinking quickly, I saw a warm poker stuck in the fire. I dashed over and grabbed it, then headed into the kitchen, just in time as Billy Ray smashed through with a roar. He was a big so-and-so, but I was ready for him. I cracked him over the head with a poker, and it absolutely knocked the stuffing out of him. He almost yelped and staggered out the door. I followed, ready to apply the coup de grace, but he recovered and ran off into the blackness. Without a thought, I headed to the front door and opened it. The front door guy had worked out what was going on, and as he tried to make good his escape, I caught him round the backside with a poker. Back inside and calming down, I realised there was no point calling the police. They might get there in the morning if I was lucky. I pulled a cabinet in front of the broken back door, got my weapon from upstairs, and sat ready for them to come back. They never did. The rest of my time passed uneventfully at the cabin, with no more uninvited guests, human or animal. I was on my guard, but realised I'd certainly sent a message to anyone who was thinking of coming up here and trying anything. Me and my friend Alex take a week out almost every year and head up to the Adirondacks for a fishing trip. The fishing spots up there are great, and the scenery and the atmosphere is just fantastic. Of course, we have a few beers and a few laughs while we're up there, usually in front of a roaring campfire. Or sometimes we head into the little towns and head to a bar. The people are really genuine and good fun. As long as you didn't try and go in peak season, there were always plenty of cottages and cabins available at a reasonable price. We left it a touch late to organise the booking, and ended up a bit further away from civilization than we wanted. The cabin we had was isolated, but had a boat dock on a small lake, which we pretty much had to ourselves, with only a few other cottages on the far side of the water, so that was nice. The first night we just relaxed, then did some fishing the next day, initially at the boat dock, until Alex tried his luck further up the bank, where the forest ended. He started doing well there, so I joined him. We fished there for most of the afternoon. At one point, Alex yawned and stretched, then came to a sudden stop as he looked round over my shoulder. "What the hell's that?" he said. I looked round and saw nothing. I asked Alex what it was. "I don't know," he said. "Looked like some big dude walking through the forest. I'm probably just seeing things." "Probably a Sasquatch," I joked. We both laughed. That night we headed off into the local town and had a few drinks. We had too many to drive, so we got a cab from the local company and left the car in town, arranging with the same cab driver to pick us up the next day at lunchtime to go back and retrieve it. As we walked up the track to the cottage, this time I thought I saw a shadow in the forest. I stopped, and Alex asked me what it was. I just said it was nothing, because I thought it was nothing. We got back to the cabin early the next afternoon, having retrieved the car, and took up our fishing spot. It was the best way to relax after a few drinks the night before. We weren't having as much luck that day, and while we were chatting about what to do, a rock suddenly bounced down the hill and out of the forest, surprising us and bouncing past to the water's edge. Looking round, we heard a cracking sound, like a baseball bat hitting a tree. "Just a rock fall, I think," I said to Alex. "You think so?" he said, looking a bit dubious. I was sure of it. Shortly after, we packed up and went back to the cabin. After a good dinner, we were enjoying a few beers and shooting the breeze. Then the car alarm went off outside. We were both baffled, but eventually came to the conclusion that some dumb animal must have set it off somehow. Then came the tricky problem of who was going to go out and check on the car. We good-naturedly argued back and forth before eventually deciding that it was only fair that both of us went out there. We were joking around with each other to make light of the situation, while at the same time not really thinking it was anything terribly serious. We got close enough to use the key to turn the alarm off, and as we did, we were plunged into near total darkness. Alex walked around the back of the car and then said, "Hey, the back lights are smashed, and there's a big dent." Before I could say a word, there was an almighty roar from back in the forest, and not too far back in the forest. Alex and I looked at each other, then without a word we sprinted back into the cabin. No sooner had we got back inside than there was a loud bang as a rock or some similar object struck the porch. More rocks came, and the blood-curdling roar came again too, closer this time. Over the next several minutes, rocks continued to hit the cabin. We were anxiously discussing not only what was going on, but what we could do about it. Peeking out the curtains, we could see the rocks bouncing off, and traced them back to the area of the car, where we sighted a silhouette of a huge figure. We had no weapon of any kind to defend ourselves. Looking around, our eyes fell on the cases of beer in the corner. There was nothing else for it. We resolved to grab some beers, charge out the door, and pelt whatever was out there. We were crapping it, but also strangely excited, as on a count of 3, we charged out and flung the full beer cans in the direction of our tormentor. To our amazement and delight, we hit something. An agonised version of the roar rang out. There was trampling of branches, then silence. We were high on adrenaline the rest of the night and didn't sleep a wink, discussing the unthinkable. There were local legends aplenty about Sasquatch in the Adirondacks, but had we really just been attacked by one in a territorial rage? We never discussed our experience with anyone, fearing ridicule. The rest of the trip was peaceful, and we've continued our fishing trips to the area ever since. Hiking is in my blood, and I am pretty well known in the hiking community in my area on the west coast. My dad was very much into hiking too. I grew up knowing many people and families in the area, and had many friendships that came out of that fraternity. I was also quite close to some of my dad's hiking buddies. In particular, a close friend of my dad's called Doug. Doug was a bit of a legend in the community. He lived in a cabin in the foothills year-round, working as a guide and also assisting the local authorities with searches and watching out for problems in the area such as fires or dangerous bears. He really was the ultimate outdoorsman. He taught me just as much as hiking about my dad and was a goldmine of knowledge. There wasn't anything he didn't know about the wilderness, and you could trust him with your life if you ever got into trouble out there. Anytime I was out in the trail, I would always drop in on Doug at his place, and he was always delighted to see me. Last summer, I was out in the trail, and I decided that was what I'd do. I had a nice warm feeling as Doug's cabin came into view on the trail, with a comforting wisp of smoke arcing lazily upwards out of the chimney. I approached the door and knocked, letting out a contented sigh and loosening the backpack from my shoulders in anticipation of resting in a comfortable chair. I smiled as the door opened, and the face behind the door wasn't Doug. It was a sandy-haired, sneering man who looked about as unwelcoming as Doug was welcoming. He was scruffy and a bit dirty, to say nothing of how shifty he looked. Hello, I stammered, thinking that I might have somehow come to the wrong cabin. I was looking for Doug. He's not here, the man responded gruffly. He said nothing else, and was all set to close the door. Where is he? I asked. The man fixed me with an unpleasant stare, as if I was a serious inconvenience. After an awkward silence, he responded, "You're still out in that trail somewhere." Well, I'm a close friend of Doug's, so I'm sure he wouldn't mind if I came in and waited for him, I said. Is that so? He replied. I don't know you. Well, I don't know you either, but I'll assume you're a friend of Doug's, and I am too, so I'm sure he wouldn't mind. The unpleasant character looked past me, as if to see if there was anyone else around. Then he just walked away from the door, leaving it open. I assumed that was as close as he got to inviting someone in, so in I went. I probably should have just said I'd come back later, but I was a little tired and needed a bit of refreshment and rest. Everything inside was perfectly normal, and there was the wonderful smell of fresh coffee. Mr. Unfriendly was sat in a rocking chair, regarding me in the same way as someone might regard something they'd just stepped in. Ah, great timing, I said, trying to break the ice. Hot coffee is just what I need. His unpleasant stare didn't change a bit. I served myself some coffee and sat down on the sofa, about 10 feet away from the guy. It became obvious that he'd no intention of saying a word, so I started talking. Specifically, I started asking him questions about how he knew Doug, where he'd met him, etc. He barely responded, a mixture of monosyllabic grunts and one word or barely audible answers. But when I started asking questions about him, his name, where he came from, how he came to be up here, that type of thing, his demeanour really changed. His eyes narrowed, he became extremely defensive, and that snarl of his got more pronounced. Suddenly he stood up and said, "You ask too many questions." After a step forward, he then said, "And you've seen my face." He reached towards the waistband of his jeans, and with a shock of adrenaline, I realised what was going on. Instinctively, I flung the remainder of the hot coffee in his face. He yelled out in pain, and as his hands went to his eyes, I jumped up and shouldered into him, sending him flying back over the chair and stumbling into a heap in the corner of the room. Knowing that he was very likely armed in some way, I didn't hang around, hightailing it out of there before the creep had time to react. As I reached the trail, I thought I heard the cabin door open. I was pretty sure he would never catch me, especially considering my intimate knowledge of the area. After the getaway, I cautiously hid in the tree line until I was satisfied I could move out. I hiked through the rest of the day, arriving at a ranger station a while after dark. Through the walk, I felt great sadness, convinced that Doug had fallen victim to the creep at the cabin. To my joy, I discovered when I got there that Doug had survived. He had tangled with the guy at the cabin, who, it turned out, was an escaped criminal on the run. And Doug had took a round in the arm as he made an escape, not long before I arrived. The criminal had assumed that Doug was badly injured and wouldn't make it back to civilization. The authorities flooded the area at first light and soon caught the man, and the trails were safe once more.